Welcome to HIST 262, History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton. Now, just as before, please forgive me for all the ums and ers and kids coming through, dogs barking, and whatnot. Okay, in this lecture, we are going to discuss the law codes of both Hammurabi and Moses, specifically discussing Hammurabi and other law codes that occurred or were written before the time of Moses, pointing out both Hammurabi as a person and his laws, and then move on to Hebraic laws, discussing Moses as a person and the Mosaic law codes. Finally, we'll compare both codes, pointing out the similarities, differences, and their claims of origin. Now, perhaps the greatest known lawgiver, outside of Moses, of course, is the king Hammurabi. After the Ur-3 Empire, the Isen-Larsa feud began. After the death of the politically strong leader of Larsa, Rim-Sin, a guy who had gained and held power during the Isen-Larsa feud, kind of bringing it to a close, well, Hammurabi stepped in and united the cities under his own strong hand and under the power of Babylon. One aspect of Hammurabi's strength and leadership included his now famous Code of Laws, a code that some secular scholars have pointed to as the origin of the Mosaic Law. Now, Hammurabi's code was something of an updated code that attained a canonical status and replaced Ur-Nammu's laws, which had, up to that point, continued to be copied. Before Ur-Nammu's laws existed, the laws of Urukagina of Lagash, who had reformed the bureaucracy of his day and cut taxes, attempting to standardize the legal system as early as 2350 BC. Between Urukagina and Moses, several other law codes existed, including the laws of Lipit-Ishtar of Isen, the laws of Darusha of Eshnuna, which date to around 1900s BC, those of Hammurabi, of course, a collection of Hittite laws that date around 1600 BC, and a whole lot more. Now, contrary to what some may think, the ancient Near East was not lawless. Now, as noted before, the laws of Hammurabi are seen by some scholars as the origin of the Mosaic Law. Now, Hammurabi himself, who is sometimes referred to as Hammurabi, depending on the phonetics, was destined for rulership since before time, at least according to Hammurabi. Now, although the true purpose of Hammurabi's code is not understood, the epilogue to the code does mention the protecting of widows, orphans, and destitute or wronged people. The concept of the strong protecting the weak from the strong no doubt protected Hammurabi's position among the people, and his continued promise of bringing safety and prosperity to the people no doubt furthered his hold even more, particularly as the king continued the well-ordered bureaucratic system first established by Rim-Sin, even to the point of relying on men at Larsa, Rim-Sin's capital, to supervise the southern regions. Thus, Hammurabi became the father of the first true imperial age of Babylon, beginning his reign with the forgiveness of debts, a common practice at the time, that solidified him as a man of the people. Hammurabi's law code does not address any types of international law, and it's really more of a jurisprudence or philosophy of law than an actual code of laws. The stela containing the code originally contained between 275 and 300 separate paragraphs, and at least 282 separate articles. This code dates to the 38th year of Hammurabi's reign and therefore was quite late, determining a culmination of a rather long tradition and possibly a collection of case law rather than an actual created law, code. Now, broadly speaking, the code consists of 5 sections of, so-called laws, including those related to false testimony, theft, labor on public lands, family, and assault and battery. And these are written in the formula, if a man does blank, then blank shall be done to him, or what is referred to as a casuistic formula, if then. Now, as with many laws, much within the laws of Hammurabi are based on equal compensation, or what has been referred to in the biblical text as an eye for an eye, including examples from the assault and battery section, such as LH, Laws of Hammurabi, LH 196, which includes the purposeful blinding of a freeman who blinded another freeman, or LH 195, where a child's hand is cut off when that hand struck its father. Now, the second instance doesn't seem as equal or fair, but the culture of the old Babylonian period believed it to be both equal and fair. And it's doubtful that a father took his child to the court for such punishment except in extreme situations. I mean, after all, a father needed his children for work and survival. Now, perhaps a better example of equal compensation comes from LH 199, which records a punishment for blinding the eye or breaking the bones of a slave as weighing the slave and delivering half of his body weight in silver to the owner of the slave. Now, to our modern ears, this may sound despicable, as slavery is despicable. But imagine having to deliver 75 to 100 pounds of silver to your neighbor after you've maimed his slave. Now, first of all, it's doubtful that a common freeman even had this much silver. And therefore, the deterrent appears as if it would have been successful. Other laws, such as those relating to the striking of a commoner by another commoner, includes only the weighing and delivering of 10 shekels of silver. A shekel being a measurement of about 8.4 grams, and not a coin, as at this point coins had not yet been invented. Now, concerning false accusations, LH number 1 describes the equal punishment for a man who accuses another of murder but cannot prove it. Now, as a punishment for murder is the equal taking of one's life, and you can look at LH 153 for that, the false accusation of murder is punished with taking the life of the accuser. Now, so the concept is, hey, you accuse this guy of murder, he's going to be killed if he's found guilty. But we found out you were lying, therefore you are killed, because that's what you were trying to make happen to this guy. So there's some equality there. Interestingly, even leniency is seen in this ancient code. For example, LH number 48 describes events out of the control of an individual that make it impossible to repay a loan, specifically natural disasters that make harvest non-viable. In this instance, the debtor need not repay the loan until the following year when a good crop is harvested. Now, the laws of Moses, or Hebraic law, date to around 400 years after Hammurabi's code, Moses dating to around 1420 BC. The time period and the similarities, which will be discussed momentarily, have caused some to question whether Moses borrowed from or adapted Hammurabi's code to his own. And therefore, a brief overview is given here. The Hebraic code is often referred to in Judaism as the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. These include Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, within these books of Moses can be counted 613 mitzvot, or commandments, a number enumerated in the Aggadah, or rabbinic homily, found in the Babylonian Talmud and Midrash Tanhuma. Many evangelical scholars believe that the Torah, or Pentateuch, as the first 5 biblical books are often referred to within Christianity, are essentially Mosaic in origin, meaning that Moses, the person, substantially wrote the books but didn't write everything, particularly the final chapter of Deuteronomy, which discusses the death and burial of Moses. Now, having Moses as an author, these books therefore date sometime before his death, obviously, which occurred at the end of the wilderness wanderings about 40 years after the Exodus. Thus, the writing of these books must date to sometime between 1446 and 1406 BC, as discussed in a different lecture. Now, of note, there's evidence of the importation of princes from the southern Levant for education in Egypt during the reign of Thutmose III, sometime around 1450 BC, events that somewhat mirror the education of Moses sometime before. Now, having been educated in the palace of Egypt, Moses no doubt both read hieroglyphic, and forgive me that image was supposed to dissolve in now, but obviously it was already there. Anyway, Moses no doubt read both hieroglyphic and cuneiform writing, along with Proto-Sinaitic, which was an alphabet based on a Semitic vocabulary that originates sometime between 1900 and 1800 BC and found in the Sinai. Now, the education of Moses and the already existent alphabet means that Moses was well qualified to have been the author of the Torah. Now, as the author of the Torah, Moses had a rather difficult job. Now, inspired through the Holy Spirit, 2 Timothy 3:16-17, Moses wrote not only a polemic against the surrounding gods and an origin story of his people, but also a code of religious laws designed to keep his people safe, healthy, and in a right relationship with their deity. As noted before, the Babylonian Talmud makes mention of 613 commandments within the Torah. Now, unfortunately, the Talmud does not provide a list of these commandments, but several rabbis have collected these into one compilation. Most notably, the medieval scholar Moses ben Maimon, commonly known as Maimonides, but also referred to by the acronym Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. Now, it should be noted that according to some scholars, Maimonides does not do that great of a job, but as I am also pulling his list out from the actual biblical text, I think it's okay. Now, Maimonides collected these commandments into two groups: 248 positive mitzvot and 365 negative mitzvot, and these are rearranged topically. Now, for this study, when referring to specific laws from the Rambam, the commandments will be listed with an initial letter P for positive and N for negative, followed by the number that Maimonides has affixed, for example, P76. And this is done just to make it easier, but note I'm also adding in the biblical reference. Now, although the Torah is made up of Genesis through Deuteronomy, the actual contents of the law comes from Exodus through Deuteronomy, beginning with Exodus 20, where Moses lists the Ten Commandments as a summary of the law. The remainder of the book of Exodus is devoted to legal regulation, including civil, criminal, and finally, differing ceremonial aspects involving the Ark of the Covenant, tabernacle, and so forth. Leviticus begins with the newly constructed tabernacle and outlines the sacrificial system, continuing on to discuss priestly duties, tabernacle worship, cleanness, the Day of Atonement, personal holiness, festivals, and laws concerning strangers. The book of Numbers recounts the Israelites' wanderings in the wilderness and includes scattered additions to the law, while Deuteronomy frames Moses' final sermon, devoting attention to the mechanics of administering justice. Now, within Christianity, the laws of Moses are typically divided into three sections, those including civil, ceremonial, and moral aspects. While this division is an acceptable partitioning of the law, it's also sometimes done as a way of dismissing certain aspects of the law, particularly what is defined as ceremonial and civil, being argued that these apply only to the Old Testament economy. Now, on the contrary, others believe that in the New Covenant, God does not dismiss the law, but empowers believers by His Spirit to live in harmony with the law. Ultimately, the entirety of the Mosaic Code is summarized by Jesus in Mark 12:28-31, when he describes the twofold division of the law as loving God and loving one's neighbor. Now, when placing both the laws of Hammurabi and the laws of Moses side by side, several similarities and several differences emerge. These differences, once identified, can be compared in order to ascertain what borrowing or adaptation, if any, has taken place. For those who believe that the laws of Moses are borrowed or copied from Hammurabi, similarities in the text are believed to be due to the inheriting of oral traditions that had been circulating in Syria and Canaan long before Israel was introduced. And in fact, there are many similarities, particularly between Hammurabi's code and those contained in Exodus 20 through 23. Compare Hammurabi with Moses when Hammurabi notes in LH1 that the one who accuses another of murder but cannot prove it should be put to death. Similarly, in N285 and P180 within Maimonides, 613 mitzvot, which are taken from Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 19, also condemn falsely testifying and falsely reporting. In addition, LH 117 describes the selling of oneself or one's family into indentured servitude in order to repay a debt. P232, looks like I have missed this somewhere. Where is P232? No? Okay, well, forgive me. I misclicked, or I forgot to change P180. That's what it was. So P232, which is taken from Exodus 21:2, also describes the purchasing of a slave, though in this instance a Hebrew slave. Now, both laws include the amount of time that the indentured servant may work before the debt is considered to be repaid. 6 years in the biblical text, 3 years in Hammurabi. At the end of this period, the servant must be freed as their obligation has been fulfilled. And by not freeing the servant, the master would be in direct conflict with these respective laws. Perhaps the best comparison comes from the regulations involving the goring of a man by an ox. LH 251 and 252 describe two separate instances. 251, where the ox is known to be dangerous, but the owner neglects to make the ox safe, and that ox in turn kills a freeman. And 252, where the ox kills a slave. In the first instance, the owner must pay half of a mina of silver, and in the second, the owner must pay a third. Likewise, in the Mosaic law, P237, lists the law concerning injuries caused by an ox, reflecting Exodus 21, 28 through 32. Now here, if the owner has neglected to render his ox safe, when the ox was known to have been dangerous, then the ox should be put to death along with the owner, unless the owner redeems his life by paying whatever is demanded of him. Now, if the ox kills a slave, then the ox should be killed and the owner required to pay 30 shekels of silver, which is about half of a mina. Additionally, LH 250 and Exodus 21:28, which falls under P237, both describe the accidental goring of a man, which results in no culpability on the part of the owner in both instances, though in the Mosaic passage, the animal is to be put to death. In addition to somewhat similar content, it should be noted that the similarities between these two are, also include formulation and sequence. For instance, the Mosaic law, found specifically within Exodus 20 through 23, follow the formula of apodictic, which are clearly established laws, followed by casuistic laws, that's the if-then laws, followed by more apodictic laws, which have close associations with the laws of Hammurabi, where the outer sections of Hammurabi are thematically similar to the outer sections of Moses, and the central, the casuistic laws can be closely associated with LH 1 through 282. Especially in that the Mosaic law within this passage specifically displays nearly the same topical order as the last half of Hammurabi's code. And if you'd like, you can pause the video to check out some of that. Now, additionally, the tripartite structure of Hammurabi's code can be seen in Deuteronomy, where Moses recounts in chapters 1 through 11 what the Hebrew deity had done for the Israelites, calling upon them to obey, and giving them a lengthy list of laws in which to follow, chapters 12 through 26, and Deuteronomy 27 to 34, which, much like the epilogue of Hammurabi's code, then reminds the Hebrews of the positive and negative consequences for obeying and disobeying. One key difference between the legal systems of Hammurabi and Moses includes the differences between civil and religious regulations. Where Hammurabi deals only with the secular, Moses quite specifically mixes the two concepts, regulating worship and criminal, family, and tort law. Thus, the heavily religious aspect of the Mosaic law necessarily equates violation of the law, including civil and criminal violations, with displeasing the national deity and therefore sin. There are also differences in organization. The apodictic laws found in Exodus 22 through 23, what some describe as the apodictic epilogue in Exodus that parallels Hammurabi's epilogue, well, they don't actually parallel. This section of the passage appears to be arranged in two equal strings, bridged by a set of instructions. But the epilogue in Hammurabi follows a sequence that creates a completely separate pattern altogether. Even in content, while the laws may discuss kindred, subject matter, the contextual differences are glaring, including differences in punishment and retribution, such as the killing of the ox which gored a man in Moses versus allowing the animal to live in Hammurabi, or the restitution of a half mina in Hammurabi versus the death of the ox's owner or redemption of that owner by paying whatever is demanded of him in Moses. Now, it would appear that Hammurabi places a much greater emphasis on monetary compensation than does Moses. The idea that similar subject matter necessarily demands adaptation from one source to another, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. In fact, it could be stated simply that the subject matter of criminal, family, and civil law are simply universal concepts found within natural law. As for the obvious stylistic and organizational similarities, the same is seen throughout Scripture, where within evangelical view, the authors write according to their individual styles as the Holy Spirit moves them. Following similar patterns found elsewhere is non-problematic. Perhaps the greatest difference, the secular of Hammurabi versus the religio-secular mixture of Moses, is best understood within the claims of origin concerning the two codes. As depicted upon the stela that houses the laws of Hammurabi, where Hammurabi is seen worshiping the deity Shamash, Hammurabi receives a rod and ring from the god, most probably related to the rod measure and rope measure utilized in temple building. These symbols have been used on seals, tablets, stelae all across Mesopotamia for millennia. And the giving of these to Hammurabi by the deity Shamash, the great sun deity, and the one who brings light, fights evil, and upholds justice and law, likely symbolizes Shamash giving Hammurabi the divine authority to create laws in the name of Shamash, rather than the deity handing laws down from the heavens, as has been suggested by others. Thus, Hammurabi was given divine approval to establish law in the land, and Hammurabi claims to have been chosen by the gods to destroy the wicked and ensure that the strong do not oppress the weak, to bring righteousness to the land. Whereas Hammurabi was given divine authority to create laws based on heavenly standards of justice, Moses received the Hebraic laws directly from the deity, as seen in several passages, including Exodus 12:4, where Moses is said to have written all the words of his God. This claim of origin differentiates itself from Hammurabi and explains why the Mosaic Law includes such religious connotations, such as the establishment of a covenant between Israel and their God, particularly as the covenant contains conditional blessings for those who keep the law and curses for those who do not. Thus, the Mosaic law establishes itself as something quite different than the laws of Hammurabi. Now, I know this lecture has been a bit on the heavy side, but I hope you've enjoyed it nonetheless. As always, feel free to contact me if you need anything.